A man by many names, Il Commendatore, Monsignor Boteroff, Herr Boter, all these nicknames belong to the same man that has been largely forgotten, but has been more important to youth football at FC Barcelona in a way that predates all the rest. La Masia was started in 1979 by then-President Josep Luis Núñez, with the desire coming from two older and trusted figures at the club, Juan Amat and Oriol Tort, and those two, along with Laureano Ruiz and of course Johan Cruyff, are credited with being the central characters in the story of La Masia. But before the fabled Farmhouse, there was still youth football at FC Barcelona that dates all the way back to 1901. And one man laid the path for all others to follow. Today, we're talking about Josep Boter Mas, the man that may have been Barcelona's greatest ever scout, and the one that, before La Masia, laid the path for it all to follow. Before things get too confusing, let's make a few terms pretty clear. La Masia, or its full name, La Masia de Can Planas, everybody knows it's the farmhouse. That's what it translates to, but for our purposes and understanding of the timeline, it is literally the farmhouse which began to house youngsters from outside the city who were taking part in the youth academy. Over time, La Masia and Barcelona's youth academy, called the Cantera, became synonymous with one another, and the building itself has had different uses through Barcelona's history. In fact, from 1961 to 1963, President Enric Laudet, being inspired by the success of Lazo Kubala, who did go on to become youth director for a time before becoming first-team manager, attempted to put more resources in youth development and the academy. Unfortunately, due to financial issues, this project only lasted 2 years and was lost to time. So with the farmhouse dormant, 1966 saw it converted into the club's social headquarters, before it was converted again in 1979 into the dormitory that gave it worldwide prestige. In 2011, the actual farmhouse closed its doors again and was replaced by the much more modern Ciudad Esportiva Juan Gamper. By obviously this time the entire academy was known and sent to a global audience as La Masia. A junior football system was founded at the club all the way back in 1901 by Juan Gamper's friend and the club's first secretary, Luis Dioso. While I have a Patreon today, which if you want to see more videos like this, make sure you help me out down in the description below, Dioso became the club's first patron due to his economic investments in the club. Dioso, one of the Spanish directors of the club, wanted an opportunity for young Spanish players to get a chance too. So while playing for the first team, he created the junior football system, and soon after, a third and a fourth team came to be. So yes, long before there was La Masia, youth football has been around at FC Barcelona about as long as FC Barcelona has been around. But let's get back to the man we're talking about today in Josep Boter Mas. He was brought into the club in 1925, having worked with the Catalan Football Federation since he was about 16 years old. And as a man, he was a figure that few could miss. He began working as a scout with Barca's youth teams, but unlike scouts today that seem to want to blend in with the seats, he was hard to miss. He was always in a suit and a tie, in an era where everybody wore a suit and tie, so that should tell you about his reputation. And he always wore a hat in the winter, but you could really tell it was him by a big bushy mustache. He took over the junior system in 1934 from President Juan Coma, who would soon resign after 3 trophyless seasons. One of the first names that he recommended when he came into the job in 1925 was Ramon Lorenz, a local talent and exceptional goalkeeper. Lorenz and some others were enough for the club to trust him as an official scout for the club, as they trusted him to bring in some players who literally were playing on the street. Josep Escola and Josep Reis were his first 2 official signings, with Escola becoming one of the top 10 goal scorers in the club's history to this day, with Josep Reis in the midfield delivering quite a few of those balls into Escola. By the time the Spanish Civil War broke out, and then afterwards, when Barcelona was on a budget, Josep Boter Mas' eye for talent, and cheap talent at that, became even more essential. There are names that I mentioned before, a lot of the ones that we don't talk about because they played for Barcelona when it wasn't their glory years, playing between the 30s and the 70s. But he scouted and signed so many from that time. Francesc Calvet, Juan Segarra, Estanislau Basora, Edward Machon, Josep Seguer, Ferran Oliveira, Enric Quintana, Justo Tejada, Elogio Martinez, Carlos Reixach, Andrea Bosch Puyol, and Josep Maria Fuste. Those are just some of the better players in their teams, not to mention that so many on the bench in that time were scouted by Boter as well. Judging by some of those names, especially in the trying times of the 60s and the 70s, you can fully understand just how important Josep Boter Mas' eye for talent was, bridging that gap between the Kubala years and the Cruyff years in particular. His signings were the ones that kept the club afloat and kept putting fans in the seats in that really difficult era, especially financially. It did help that he knew what he was looking for, he also knew who to trust, and he knew how to treat his players. He had created networks in Mallorca and Girona and all throughout Spain. So those people that he would use as his network would do the first scout, and then he would travel each and every time to do the second scout himself. He looked for touch with both feet and good ball control, but he'd also look for those intangibles, how a player dressed, their body language on the field, and whether or not they had that special spark. When they did, he would make sure they were taken care of. He would take the players out to eat, he would wait for trains with them, and he would take them to fancy restaurants when they couldn't get home for the holidays. Because before there was La Masia, there was the Pension Patata, the potato place, which was a boarding house that housed between 40 to 50 of those youngsters. It was named for that because of the fried potatoes that were seemingly served with every meal. But it wasn't just that place. There was a number of private boarding houses around the city of Barcelona that Josep Boter Mas would make sure those youngsters were taken care of at. Those players who he helped remember him fondly. And it's those players that went from a scouting report to an FC Barcelona shirt to a suit up in the stands with him where his legacy lives on. Lorenz, who you remember was the first player he ever scouted, became his right-hand man for close to 40 years. And it wasn't just Lorenz. Josep Escola, Josep Samitier, Paco Rodri, and Javier Comenge all went from knowing Boter from the stands to sitting up there with him. And remember Ordel Tort, considered one of the greatest scouts in football history? He heavily relied on the experienced Boter. Tort's involvement in the creation of La Masia is a direct link back to Boter. And even Messi, who signed on a napkin with Carlos Reixac. Remember, who signed and scouted Carlos Reixac? The reason he isn't spoken about anymore is obviously because not only did he exist pre-video, but it seems like in modern times La Masia is getting oversimplified to being Cruyff and Guardiola and not much else. But videos like this do help to make sure that he is not forgotten to time. But it's interesting that Boter might have actually wanted it this way. The farther along a player got in the first team, the farther it seemed like Boter moved away from their lives. He didn't look for the recognition of having signed this player or that player, and he did kind of fade into obscurity as his health problems started to build up. He retired from the club in 1973 due to poor health, and the club held a tribute match for him right after they signed Johan Cruyff. Did you want another thread, by the way? There's another one. And more than 80 players took part in the tribute match. These included Fuste, Antonio Ramallets, Elogio Martinez, Josep Saguer, and Kubala. Near the end of his life, he dealt with financial difficulties and died in a great deal of debt at the age of 72. And by the time of his death, he was already being forgotten. A 1-minute moment of silence at a youth match was the final way he was honored. But fortunately, today we have the technology and curiosity to remember him again. So I do hope you enjoyed the story of Josep Boter Mas. And if you did, and again, if you want more videos like this, subscribe to the channel, give it a like. I always appreciate it. And as always, until next time, Forza Barca.